spring-fed lake. More details about independent living at aldergatesliving.org.
This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. The COVID disruption of our schools revealed some troubling weaknesses and inequities. After struggling through a year of remote education, teachers are now trying to bring schooling back to normal while catching children up on what they missed. And test scores indicate they missed a lot. Meanwhile, the legislature has begun steps to reconsider education policy in general. They formed a House Select Committee on an education system for North Carolina's future to study a broad range of issues, including how the state funds schools and how teachers are compensated. They met for the first time last month, and last week they heard from State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Truitt, who said that it's time to rethink the state standardized exams, as well as how we measure school performance and quality. And she also told them that perhaps it would be better to prepare students for careers, insisting that the college for all cry from the 90s and 2000s needs to become careers for all. Joining us to talk about all of that and more is Mary Ann Wolf, President and Executive Director of the Public School Forum of North Carolina, which describes itself as an organization founded to, quote, speak truth to power in its efforts to be a nonpartisan champion of better schools. She's also the former chair of the Chapel Hill Carborough School Board. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
And we welcome back James Ford. He is a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education at large. He's also a former CMS and North Carolina Teacher of the Year. Good to see you again, James. Welcome.
Good to be back. Thanks, Mike.
Sarah Basinger is here. She's the parent of a CMS graduate and a CMS high school junior. She's also a member of the Education Action Team of the League of Women Voters, which works under the belief that a high-quality public education is necessary to sustain democracy. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks. It's my privilege to be here.
And we'll disabuse you of that in short order. And Terry Stoops is here. He's a former high school teacher who is now director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation, a conservative think tank based here in North Carolina. And they are frequently guests on this program. Terry, welcome to you.
Thank you for having me.
I want to mention that we invited the chairs of the House Select Committee on an Education System for North Carolina, that's the title of the committee, to be part of this discussion since we were going to be talking about them this morning. And they have committee meetings scheduled for this hour, so they could not be with us. So, James, let me start with you. The year of remote learning had a serious, quantifiably negative impact on learning. Test scores show serious, almost calamitous losses among many students across the state. CMS fared poorer than most other districts. But are we making headway now in regaining the lost ground? Have teachers and the public schools been given the tools needed to catch kids up? James.
Yeah, I feel like that's a hard question to answer. One is you can't deny the disruption to the learning process, right? But that also makes some of those data a little less reliable, right? Because of, you're assessing kids in the midst of a pandemic with, unequal access to education, equal access to resources, the great resignation with teachers, et cetera. But a lot of those those inequities are pre-existing. And really what this pandemic did was expose it. If nothing else, we can't deny it. And we've attempted to try to target resources to help some of these kids. But one thing we got to recognize is that it wasn't functioning well to begin with. I'm glad we're raising the alarm and our antennas are up and we're starting to see that. But it's going to take us doing right and fully funding schools and implementing resources in targeted ways if we want to increase achievement. But I mean, as I'm sure you're going to explore, those are very political discussions, right? That when you, on the one hand, acknowledge the inequities, but talk about the remedies, that's where people start to split into camps. And so my hope is that we can make headway.
So Mary Ann Wolf, what this pandemic did, as James just said, is really put under a spotlight inequities that have existed for a very long time. And your organization, the Public School Forum of North Carolina, has spent 30 years trying to improve schools. You've brought together people from education, from business, from government to help develop education policy. Have your efforts worked?
So that's a wonderful and very complicated question. And I think we continue to better understand what the needs are. And as James said, a lot of the needs and the inequities were there before the pandemic, but we also know that the pandemic did cause different disruptions. And so I think when you consider what schools need, as an example, we know that teachers are the #1 school-related factor that impacts student outcomes. And we as a state have had moments where we invest in our educators, and we've had moments when unfortunately we don't. And right now we know that we are nearly 40th in the country in terms of teacher pay and other working conditions. And so when we look at those investments right now, it's not to say we're just throwing money at schools. What we're saying is we're investing at the very human capital that we know makes a deep impact on students. And so as we look at this right now, I think there's a very common sense path of what do we need to support our students. We need to understand where they are, their academic, social, and emotional needs. As many have said, including during the committee meeting last week, we need to look at how we measure student success. We need to have multiple measures and think differently about that. But we always need to be honing in on what is it that students need and how do we impact that, which means we need to have a high quality, well-prepared teacher in every classroom. We need a pipeline. We need school support personnel like counselors, psychologists, social workers, and we need the resources in order to meet those needs. So we all acknowledge that we have a long way to go, but we also know that there are very straightforward, common sense paths that are good for kids, good for families, but also good for our state's economy. And so I'm hopeful that we can continue, as James said, to work together on this, because this makes a sense not just for families, it makes sense for the state.
Terry, you were in the classroom, I think in Virginia. I think you taught, what did you teach? Tell me what you taught.
I taught 5th grade, actually, a
No, no,
very
no.
long time
Okay,
ago.
so
Yes.
we have 3 teachers on the classroom. I was actually talking to Terry Stoops. You taught in Virginia. What did you teach, Terry?
It's Spotsylvania High School. It was 11th and 12th grade English.
God help you. All right. And now you're the director of the John Locke Foundation's Center for Effective Education. Do you believe that North Carolina effectively educates the students in its care?
Well, it does. I mean, and not every student, but there are students that get an outstanding education in North Carolina. So to say that there is a universal condemnation of our public schools would really be contrary to the fact that there are students that get a fantastic education. But there are many students that are left behind, and I think Marianne and James would agree that the data that we're getting from the pandemic tells us that students of color and low-income students were disproportionately affected negatively by the pandemic. And schools that closed for longer periods for in-person learning tended to have worse outcomes for students. So, and those tended to be schools with that were predominantly at least 50% of students of color. So we have a lot of work to do in North Carolina, and there is some indication of a way forward. One of the ways that we can start addressing these issues is through high dosage tutoring. Now, I hate the term high dosage tutoring, but that's what the researchers are using. You know, we have some issues with staffing that can be addressed by the $5.7 billion that the federal government shipped down to North Carolina for the pandemic relief. We've only spent about 1.5 billion of that. So the real question that we're going to face as a state is, how will school districts decide to use the money, the tremendous amount of money that the federal government gave to the state to address this learning loss? The tricky part of this whole thing is that these school districts really have a great deal of discretion with regard to how this money is used. And so my hope is that they use it for high dosage tutoring and that they seek out alternative ways to provide it, especially for those students that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. But so far what we've seen is across the board raises for teachers, which I think makes sense in the short term, perhaps to address some of those staffing issues. But the truth is that North Carolina is not alone in a lot of these staffing challenges. Even the most well-resourced states still are encountering many problems with recruiting, retaining teachers. And so North Carolina is really going to have to get creative in the way that it approaches its staffing issues. And perhaps some of those creative approaches can be addressed in the committee that the House has put together to discuss some of these innovative approaches that perhaps we haven't tapped yet.
We'll talk more about funding, and we'll talk more about how the fact that this pandemic revealed some really serious cracks between the haves and the have-nots, which were certainly there before all of this started, and how we address that problem. But Sarah, you have one graduate from CMS, and you have another still in the system. At one point in our history, CMS was the poster child for the integration of the school system, and had, or maybe still has, a stellar reputation among other school systems around the country. We were one of the great systems in the country, according to many people. What's your take on where we are today, particularly in the Charlotte area, when you consider everything that we've been talking about this morning?
Sure. So as a parent, I see that there are classrooms right now during the pandemic, but even prior to the pandemic, that don't have a teacher in front of the kids. There are often, we're being asked by the parent teacher associations often to donate supplies and offer rides and, fill in the gaps where the lack of funding is making it hard for the schools to meet the kids' needs. And I think that in Charlotte, certainly I feel like this teacher retention issue, the teacher shortages that we're experiencing, I think WCNC had noted, I think in December, that 871 teachers have left since August 1st. And if we think about that for a second, 871 teachers of I believe there are 9,000 teachers in CMS. 871, so almost 10% have left. And if we think about that, they're not leaving at the end of a school year. They're feeling so unsupported and undervalued right now that they are choosing the heartbreaking decision, because most teachers that go into the profession love their kids, love what they do, but they're so overwhelmed and overworked and underpaid that they are 10% of CMS teachers left mid-year. And that is an alarm that I want to sound for all
That's happening around the country, and I'm wondering, do you think it's simply because of the pandemic and the stresses put on the teachers in the last year when they were at remote and had to learn a whole new way of teaching? Is it that? Is it not enough money? Is it something else at work here? And I have 30 seconds.
Sure. I believe it's certainly exacerbated by the pandemic, but these teachers were feeling overwhelmed ahead of time. Their planning periods were being taken away from them. They don't have the resources to meet their kids' needs, and that has existed for a long time.
So when we come back, we will talk about why they don't have the resources that they need, because I know the State Board of Education took steps in 2020 to support the opportunity gaps. And then we've had the Leandro case, which has been operative for 27 years, which demands that the state adequately fund education. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. We'll talk about that when we come back at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Theo Ed Talks, where leaders in the church and the academy explore the power of faith to change lives and communities. February 27th at Queen's University. Tickets and more information at theoed.com. And Hendrick Acura open in-store and online with pickup and delivery options available, and no contact digital sales experience, and the new 2022 RDX and MDX. Details at hendrickacura.com. Around the country, mask mandates are coming down, and now all eyes here turn to Mecklenburg County and its new public health director, Dr. Raynard Washington. He will join us on this program tomorrow to talk about where we are with COVID and about his decision on masking. Meanwhile, the CDC guidance on masks and COVID restrictions has been criticized as confusing, and we'll talk about whether that criticism is fair and what our approach should be tomorrow at 9.
I'm WFAE climate reporter David Borax. Our reporting brings you the big developments as our public utilities respond to climate change.
We will be out of coal by 2035. And we project that coal will be contributing only 5% of generation by 2030.
Keep up with climate news and subscribe to our weekly climate newsletter at wfae.org/climate news. Climate coverage on WFAE is supported by the One Earth and Salamander Funds.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the state of education in North Carolina today, and we're also talking about the House Select Committee on an education system for the state, which formed last month, I think, and met last week. And we'll talk about all of that as we go through the hour with Marianne Wolf, President and Executive Director of the Public School Forum of North Carolina. Sarah Basinger is an ed team member, education team member, and a CMS parent at the League of Women Voters. Terry Stoops is Director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation, and James Ford is a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education. There has long been this achievement gap, which you started the program talking about, James, brightly highlighted by these recent test scores, which were disastrous, particularly among that group of people, mostly all across the state, but particularly at CMS. The State Board of Education took steps in 2020 to tackle opportunity gaps and identified ways to improve performance by 2025. Well, it's 2022. We got 2.5 years left. Where are we on that?
On that front? Yeah. So I think it's a long trajectory. And I want to appreciate Terry for acknowledging that students of color suffered worse academically as a result of the pandemic, because when you acknowledge that fact from where I sit, people get upset, but it is a fact. And yeah, the state board did adopt a strategic plan to close opportunity gaps amongst those subgroups and others. For those who don't know, the State Board of Education is the second most powerful education policy making body in the state, subordinate to the General Assembly. But the General Assembly, right, allocates a lot of the funding. And so in our state, 60% of school funding comes from the state. About 30% is local and roughly 10% comes from the feds. And so ultimately the operationalizing of that happens on the ground. And so we can lay out a roadmap and a plan, which I think districts have done an excellent job aligning a lot of their plans to, but ultimately it's about whether the funding exists and whether the leadership and implementation exists to make it happen. And so, we still have a long way to go. But I do think targeted interventions for those groups are necessary. But again, as I mentioned from the outset, Mike, when you say those things, that upsets a lot of people. It immediately becomes politicized. And, I think we need to move away from that and just do what's right.
I've been doing this program now for, I think, 24 years. We've had, I cannot count the number of conversations about education on this program, and before that, elsewhere where I worked in this region. And we've always been talking about funding. We've always been talking about the opportunity gap, the achievement gap. In 1997, the state Supreme Court ruled that the state constitution guaranteed every child in North Carolina the right to a sound basic education. And the court found at the time that the state was not providing enough money to achieve that goal. And recently, a state court ordered the state to provide $1.7 billion more to state education departments. It's been, 25, 26, 27 years, James? Why are we still talking about this? Why is this still ongoing?
So I'll provide, it's Black history, so I'll provide a little bit of context. This is my personal theory. The universal tax supported system of schools in the South was created by Black folks. It came out of the Reconstruction era, right? So that right that we have in the North Carolina Constitution is there because of freed persons. Not long after that, Confederates retook the House and immediately separated the schools and began deliberately underfunding Black schools, right? So when you talk about funding inequity, that's the root of it right there. The districts that we're talking about, the original 5 and some of the other ones, are districts that are consequently very Black and brown. And so I do think the constituency of the high poverty schools is 77% students of color. There's an element there that a person like myself would be foolish to not acknowledge, right? I think a lot of this is about denying that fundamental right, and if at worst and at best it's absolute negligence. But I'll allow the listeners to be the judge of that question.
Marianne, we're talking here about the Leandro case. Some have said highlights the grim state of how public education is financed, not just here, but across America. And North Carolina has been described as the most extreme example of that. And our state has repeatedly been found to be out of compliance with its own constitutional guarantees to a sound basic education. How do you explain that? And when did this start? Has it always been this way?
So I think there's a lot of different theories on where it started. I really appreciated James highlighting, some of the beginnings of our challenges. When we look at the Leandro case, I think one of the things that I struggle with the most is that it's not something a lot of folks like to talk about, the case itself. But what I like to boil down to is what's in there. What did the research and data show us that matters for schools? And it showed us things like early childhood education matters. We need post-secondary pathways. We need a high quality teacher and principal. We need student support, and we need an accountability system that actually allows us to understand where kids are. And so I say all that because, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I'm just going to say the term high quality teachers and principals has come up several times in the last 30 minutes of this program. Don't we have high quality teachers and principals in schools? And if not, why are they there?
So we have many high quality teachers and principals, but when you think about what Sarah was saying about the attrition, or the fact that we've had attrition for many years, we've had a systemic issue in this state where we have had a 50% decline in our ed prep programs over the last decade. So 10 years ago, we had double the number of people in our ed prep programs.
What is an ed prep program?
That's a great question. It is our colleges of education and other programs that prepare our teachers. And so we've seen this dramatic decline. And I think when we look across this, we know that we want to be attracting people into the field. But what Leandro shows us as the research, and again, let's go to what the research says, is that we have not been doing what we need to attract, recruit, and keep those educators in our schools. And that takes honoring the profession. These are highly educated individuals in our schools who have other opportunities in other industries, but we are not only behind the national average by $10,000, per teacher, like our average pay is $10,000 below, but we're also not honoring the profession of teaching here to say that education and what you're doing is what we're going to honor that. And I think that's what makes people leave too.
There are people leaving their jobs in every field right now, partly because they felt they were underpaid, partly because they feel that they are underappreciated, partly because they just are reevaluating their lives and their career paths. Terry, we have long heard that teachers are underpaid and underrespected. As a person who's both in the classroom and representing a conservative organization, conservatives often say the answer is not money. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you look at some of the states that pay teachers less than us, and you find levels of satisfaction that exceed ours. And so it's really a matter of working conditions. If we're thinking about what makes teachers happy, what makes teachers stay in the classroom, again and again, and pay is definitely a factor. Let's not pretend that pay isn't a factor, that compensation is irrelevant to this. And when I say compensation, it's important to put it in the context of not just a salary, but teachers receiving over $20,000 in benefits. And those benefits are becoming more and more expensive. I mean, one of the reasons why North Carolina isn't able to give teachers larger raises is because the cost of healthcare continues to increase. The cost to maintain our pension system is increasing astronomically. And we've done a good job of making sure that our pension system and our healthcare system remains one that is competitive, I think, with the private and nonprofit sectors. But those expenses continue to increase, and therefore they take a lot of money away that we could otherwise give to teachers in the form of salary. So.
And that's happening in every industry across the country. Healthcare benefits are becoming onerous on all these different companies and organizations, and we would have had universal health care had it not been for Republican opposition. We can talk about that on another program on another day, however. David Ciara, who is Executive Director, I think that's how you say his name, at the National Research and Advocacy Group, the Education Law Center. Sarah says that what needs to be done is to hold legislatures to account for the, quote, deplorable ways schools are funded. We've got to reckon with this as a nation, he says. Do you agree? And is that what the Leandro case is all about? And once it's resolved, if we followed the restrictions of the Leandro case or the advice of it, would it solve the problem?
Well, as you know, I'm wearing two hats here, both as a CMS parent and then at the League of Women Voters for Charlotte Mecklenburg. And certainly, I mean, we have spent a lot of time thinking about how the Leandro, born out of that was the comprehensive remedial plan that if it were fully funded could solve so many of these problems. We don't endorse candidates, but we do support positions, and we support that position of high quality, equitable education for all. But what we're working to do is to educate all the stakeholders about, parents, teachers, administrators, legislatures, urban folks, rural communities who were the initial plaintiffs in the Leandro case, to understand that the system, it needs further support. We need to not shirk the constitutional mandate, and we have a moral obligation to children to see that they have access to the sound basic education.
Terry, I've had a former school board chair at CMS tell me that it was his impression, and the impression of many other people, that the Republican-controlled legislature here and those around the country don't believe in public schools and have actively worked to weaken the public schools through their increasing the number of charter schools and school vouchers, et cetera. They don't want them to work. And he pointed to ALEC, which is something else we don't need to talk about today. But what do you say to that? Do Republicans in the legislature believe in public education? If so, why are they so reluctant to fully fund it?
Well, I think that's a question that you would need to ask them directly, and hopefully they'll come on the show to address those issues.
But you talk to them.
But I would say that they believe that one size doesn't fit all. And that when you're talking about individual students with individual needs and families with unique circumstances, that there should be a pluralistic school system that addresses those needs in a way that may not always find students success in the traditional public school system. And so we have public charter schools, we have private school voucher programs, we have homeschooling, as a recognition that there are many student needs that can't necessarily be met by the traditional district system. And if you look at in the 19th century, we very much had a kind of pluralistic system that I think a lot of Republicans are advocating for today. Now, as far as Leandro goes, I think the legislature is simply pointing out the fact that the Constitution endows them with the power to write the checks. They have the power as a constitutional authority to make sure that the taxpayer dollars are addressed and directed in ways that are according to the needs and the general needs of the states. Now, one thing about the Leandro case, I think that isn't recognized very well is that our governance system in North Carolina is a confusing mess. Jim Hunt once said that the distinguishing feature about education in North Carolina is that the buck doesn't stop anywhere. And so the idea of throwing at least $8 billion via Leandro into a system with such a confused governance structure, I think many lawmakers recognize that is just plain folly.
Mary Ann, you wanted to comment on that?
Sure. I think one of the things here is that if we really focus on kids and what kids needs, it really changes the conversation. And there's a couple of points I would just like to raise is that our public schools offer so many choices within them, whether dual language, early college, leadership, and different academies. And something that I think we need to all lift up more is acknowledging that within our public school systems, there are many different choices, and our public schools will educate every child, right? They are there to serve every child. We've identified, we've talked about, and we're willing to acknowledge that we know students of color, sometimes our students with special needs, we have not done as good of a job as we want to, and we want to do better, but our public schools offer that. So I think if we focused on what kids need, we would see that those investments are there, and the investments help the kids, but they also are proven to help the state overall.
A listener tweets, increase educator salaries by 50%, pay those teachers who have had their master's degrees at a higher rate, break up CMS as the district is too big and full of bloat and inefficiency, invest in our future, which takes us to this, invest in our future, because it's not just the children who are our future, it's the future of the country. If we don't have an educated workforce and people who can reason and think and understand concepts, you cannot have a successful nation. And we're in competition on a worldwide stage with people who want to eat and are, in some cases, eating our lunch. So as this state has put together this new committee, this this House Select Committee on Education System for the Future of North Carolina, what message does that send, James? Is that a good thing, or do we need to rethink this? Is it not? It's not just about money. Should we be reshaping how we're doing things?
So the message that it sends to me, I'll be honest, is really fishy, right? Like it's suspect. So this committee is put together to outline the future of education in the state, and yet it doesn't even look like the future of education in the state. Like, to my knowledge, is what, one person of color. There's one person of color on this committee, and we're 52% students of color in North Carolina. So, I mean, that's an obvious mismatch there. But then secondarily, a lot of the conversation was really spent on, in my estimation, the first meeting in January, talking about the limits of power for the State Board of Education. I think somebody recommended that the state superintendent be in charge of the state board, which is in direct violation of the state constitution. And then just a lot of like, whereas I agree, Mike, with your sentiment that in part, the education system should at least prepare folks for the workforce. My lens is different. Conversations about education that strictly look at it as an economic venture and not a holistic venture run counter to the way that a lot of Black communities have historically looked at education as more of a liberal arts, holistic, critical thinking endeavor. And traditionally, it's been, as it's been structured, industrial education. If you do the research, it's been preparing Black and brown folks for low-wage manual labor. That has been the movement that has been the thrust of traditional public education. So the way I hear and the way I read as a historian, I'm looking at that, I'm like, if it's just about that, it's not about the broader concepts of education, opening up one's mind and making them a well-rounded individual, and it doesn't look like the composition of the state, I immediately become suspect.
I want to come back to that later in this program, the fact that they're talking about someplace we've been before as though it were a new approach where you have two tracks. You have a college track and you have a workforce track. And I thought we had gotten rid of that because we wanted to invite everybody to the table, but maybe not. And maybe not everybody can come to the table. But we'll talk about that when we come back. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Atrium Health, dedicated to promoting better lives to better health with comprehensive care focused on overall wellness. Atrium Health. Coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, Florida lawmakers are looking to restrict what teachers can say about sexuality and gender in the classroom. Critics say this new legislation is hateful. What's behind the push? I think we know. But that's coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock on 1A, and we'll have that for you at that time. And when we come back from the break, more on the future of education and education policy here in North Carolina. Stay with us.
Black Profiles presented by listener-funded public radio 90.7 WFAE. Amid the protests over the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, a group of musicians formed the Charlotte Strings Collective in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. The mission of the multiracial community ensemble is to celebrate the music of Black classical composers from Chevalier de Saint-Georges and Florence Price to Timothy Adams and local violist Taylor Bird. The ensemble also features dancers from UNC Charlotte and Winthrop University.
Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about the state of education in the state of North Carolina, not just at CMS this morning. And we're also going to spend some time talking about what's going on with the House Select Committee on an education system for North Carolina's future. We're talking about all this with James Ford, a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education at large. Marianne Wolf is president and executive director of the Public School Forum of North Carolina. Terry Stoops is director for the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. And Sarah Basinger is an education team member for the League of Women Voters. Sarah, James just expressed some of his misgivings about this House Select Committee. But the legislature formed it. They charged them with reconsidering education policy. And Gaston County Republican Representative John Torbett, who chairs the committee, says they are, quote, going to reimagine what they would do to create an education system if one didn't already exist in North Carolina. That may send shivers up your spine. It may make you hopeful. I'm not sure which, but what advice would you give that committee?
Well, I'm grateful in a sense that it is a bipartisan committee, but not by much. And I'm actually charged with the State League. I've been given the role to be an observer of this committee. And my takeaways from the first two, well, first of all, they were formed on December 16th of last year with the mandate to complete their work by the end of 2022. And possibly bringing any legislation forward by May of this year. And certainly their charge that Representative Torbett put in front of the committee to, reimagine education, it just smacks of a lack of respect for what came out of Leandro and the West Ed report and the comprehensive remedial plan that already exists as a great blueprint for where we should be going.
Marianne, some of the people who have testified before this committee already have spoken about the relationship of parents to education, and we've been witnessing a change in how parents relate to teachers in schools. When I went to school, if the teacher said something about Johnny, the parents blamed Johnny. They didn't blame the teacher. And that's not the case as much anymore. And we're also witnessing parents at school board meetings across the country demanding a greater voice in what their children are taught and the books that are in the library, et cetera. Tamika Kelly, president of the North Carolina Association of Educators, said that peripheral education involvement does not make you an educator. It is not a substitute for professional experience, expertise, and skill. What's your reaction? What should parents be doing?
So one of the interesting things that I've heard about during the pandemic and talking with teachers and, being a school board member, but also with principals, is that in some cases, it opened doors for more parent engagement. And as a former teacher and as a school board member, the parent engagement was critical for us understanding what was happening in our schools, what was needed, but also our principals and teachers actively want that engagement to support students. And one of the things I think, if we reflect on what we see in the news and what we see happening at school board meetings, is if we're focused truly on kids and what kids needs, it tends to make sense. If we're looking at their academic, their social, and their emotional needs and how we support them, we often get to rich engagement and discussion, whether about, obviously in a school board meeting, not about individual kids. I think what happens sometimes is the discussion becomes more about the adults than about our students and how our education system can help those students. And that's where I think we go awry. I think school districts and schools and teachers have long welcomed engagement with parents and continue to, but with that deep focus on kids.
Some of this discontent with the schools and perhaps parents wanting a greater voice is because of the diminishing faith that we have in all of our institutions in this country. Some of it justified, some of it coming from fake news, and unjustified, and that's the truth when it comes to schools as well. But we do constantly hear about kids not being able to read at grade level while they're being taught peripheral things that parents don't believe in. And they have said, Terry, that parents have said that they are their child's first teacher. They should call the shots. Another Republican a member of this committee, David Willis from Union County, has said that parents have abdicated their responsibilities to schools and they need to be students' best advocates. He added, we have to go back to understanding what the parents' responsibilities actually are. What is he saying there? That they're talking out of both sides of their mouth, the wrong side of their mouth. They're putting their focus in the wrong place or the right place. What is he saying?
Well, I think he is just looking and trying to explore ways for positive involvement of parents. And if that means giving them a greater say in where their child attends school, then that is one way to maybe address some of these cultural conflicts that we see bubbling up with what's taught in schools, what books are in the library, et cetera. I think that for too long, parents have been thinking that they should just trust teachers, trust administrators, and allow whatever those school staff to do, and assume that that's in the best interest of their child, only to find that that's not always the case. And so I think that the General Assembly is looking for ways to direct parental involvement in positive ways. I think this committee, what I consider to be a brainstorming committee, is one way to do that, to start considering some of these things. I think James's point is apropos. I think that there does need to be diverse voices coming before the committee to discuss some of the different views from different communities, communities of color, low-income individuals from around the state, rural, suburban, urban, to get an entire picture of what education looks in the state, how we can increase parental involvement, and maybe find ways to direct it in positive ways, because we're going to only be successful if we have the involvement of parents, the deep involvement of parents who really understand their child in a very intuitive level. They may not be able to describe in an educator's terms how their child learns, how their child behaves, but they can understand their child's preferences, their different ways of being that allow them to make a decision on how best to educate their child. You know, one thing about the way that we organized our education system is that you're assigned to a school based on where you live. And that's not always the best situation for children. And I think that if we start thinking about it in different ways and make parents start to think about where their child attends a school and what their child is learning in school, then maybe they'll be able to assist schools in making informed decisions about what is being taught and where their child attends that school.
Of course, to do that, you'd have to have busing, which we just got rid of. James, you were nodding too much of that. So you're obviously in agreement with what Terry had to say.
Yeah, I am. My thing is the diversity of the parents that you're engaging. I'm in support of parent engagement, and I think you're hard pressed to find folks who genuinely won't be. But the question always is which parents. And I was happy to hear Terry acknowledge, like, we're talking about parents of not just students of color, low income parents, parents of students with learning disabilities and learning difference, multilingual parents. And I think about the work of, organizations like the Village of Wisdom in Durham, who really works with Black parents to help develop a learning profile, a Black genius profile, and help impute to schools what they believe that their student needs in order to live and grow and to thrive in the school environment. And those aren't the parent groups, and that's not the work that we tend to hear about when we hear all the, the hoopla about parents showing up. I want to hear more from parents like that and from organizations and outfits that are doing that kind of work. And I think then we can properly get at a more equitable system, but that requires a different lens and a different approach.
The state superintendent of public instruction, Catherine Truitt, spoke to the committee, suggesting end of grade tests that the state has been using for years are not good tests. She said the ACT, the college entrance exam, which every student is required to take, quote, is not a good predictor of success. And she said the way we grade schools should be changed to include the metrics based on testing, parent satisfaction, and their access to teachers and more. Marianne, you were on a school board, you were a teacher. What are your thoughts?
So I really appreciate this idea that one assessment on one day does not capture what a student knows, especially when we think about all the things that James and Terry, quite frankly, just described on our differences across our students and what they need. And so this idea of moving towards a multi-factor approach at how we know where students are and how they can show us what they know is very, very important, I think. And it's not just important at the end of the year or how we assess the success of our schools. Teachers want information that they can use immediately, right? So whether we're thinking about the supports they bring in through high impact tutoring or using our school support personnel, as a teacher, I wanted information that I could use immediately to better meet the needs of my kids. And a lot of times that's formative assessments in the classroom that you can use to understand that. So I think there's in Leandro that set the roadmap, and many of us are in agreement. We need to look at that differently. But what we can't ignore here, and a point I wanted to bring back, is the voice of teachers and principals in these discussions, because they are deeply connected to how kids are doing and where they sometimes see that the assessments don't match that. So whether through the committee or through these discussions, I hope we're listening to parents, to students, to teachers and principals, so that we are truly getting a holistic picture of what we can do.
James just mentioned he's troubled by the makeup of this House Select Committee because it's pretty much white guys. What about teachers? Are there any educators on that select committee? Any former educators, Sarah? Sarah?
Sorry, yes. So the only person with any teaching experience on the committee is Rachel Hunt. And she's the daughter, of course, of Jim Hunt, who championed many of the policies that made us, I think we were at one time called a model, of in education and the education state. And it's not for lack of teacher dedication that we've fallen from that place. But yes, Rachel's the only one on the committee with any education experience.
So we have 4 minutes left, and we must talk about this at greater depth. Catherine Truitt also emphasized her belief that the role of public education is to prepare students for the workforce, because that creates a pathway to economic mobility and to the middle class. She's certainly correct about that. But she needs she says we need to make sure that students are introduced to the notion of a K through 12 career path early on and replace the cry, college for all, with careers for all. We heard from James a little bit about this, and I want to go back to James in a second about it. But Marianne, Sarah, what are your thoughts on that? That sounds like a two-track system from the very beginning.
I'll take that. While I'm all for giving many opportunities for children to see that what their future can bring, I'm afraid that policy might be looking at kids with learning challenges and Black and brown kids as the ones that might be shuttled into that path. And so that tactic makes me uneasy.
Marianne.
So I think the problem here is it's not either or, right? We want to prepare our kids for college, career, and citizenship, and all students need to be able to explore and learn and find pathways. So yes, helping students understand that there are pathways, there are different ways to get there. There are many, many opportunities is critical, but we also know that students have to be very adaptable. They have to be able to communicate, critical thinking, because that's what our world is asking for now. And so I think it has to be all of the above.
And that's what we need for an educated, we need an educated population to have a successful democracy, which plays into what Sarah's group believes. Terry, it is true that you have to have an education to have upward mobility and to be in the middle class. But it also seems that college educated people make more over their lifetimes. If we train people not for college, but to be some schlub in an office, are we cheating them of their economic mobility?
Well, you could talk to my plumber, and he makes much more, I think, than the schlub in the office. And so you
That's
could see
true.
the individuals going into trades making enormous salaries. But my boys, both of my boys, go to Vernon Malone Career and College Academy. It's Wake County's career and technical education school. My oldest is doing computer programming. My youngest is doing biotech. So this idea that just because you're sending a child to a career and technical high school or a career and technical path, that it's not rigorous or doesn't prepare necessarily for college, I think is incorrect. It's based on a really antiquated notion of what career and technical education is. And so I think that if you look at what really career and technical education is today, you find that it's preparing kids for college if they want to go that route. It's preparing children for a career that can pay off in substantial ways if they decide not to go to college or to only get a 2-year degree. So, I think she's right to emphasize it. Mike Easley for years kept talking about all the children need to go to college. He wrote a book called Look Out College, Here I Come. Bev Perdue, to her credit, brought North Carolina back to thinking about career and technical education. And I think Catherine Truitt is a continuation of that correction that we saw thanks to Bev Perdue.
Wow, thanking a Democrat. Good for you. Terry Stoops, director of the Center for Effective and Education at the John Locke Foundation. That's a conservative think tank in the Carolinas. Sarah Basinger is an education team member at the League of Women Voters and a CMS parent. James Ford, a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education, former Teacher of the Year here and statewide. And Marianne Wolf, president and executive director of the Public School Forum of North Carolina. Thank you all for the hour.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte, our